I wasn't waiting for them to drop the cake. It wasn't when my son-in-law leaned over and put his hand on the small of my daughter's back. It's like he was steering a shopping cart. It wasn't even when my own younger sister stood up at the head table at my daughter's wedding, in the dress I'd helped her choose, and tapped a fork against her champagne glass. Before anyone had invited her to speak, it was the moment right after that, when my lawyer, sitting 2 tables back in a blazer that had seen 30 years of courtrooms, set down his coffee cup so quietly that somehow everyone heard it anyway. That was the moment the room actually changed. My name is Eleanor Whitcomb, and for 61 years I thought I understood my own family. I want to tell you about the day I found out how wrong I was, and what happened after, because I think some of you will recognize a version of this in your own lives. I read every comment. I'll be here after. Let me back up. I live outside Kingston, Ontario, in a stone farmhouse my late husband Desmond and I bought in 1994 with money we did not have, and renovated ourselves over 11 winters. Desmond was a structural engineer. I am an accountant, the kind who built a small but very stable practice doing books for family businesses across Frontenac County. Nothing glamorous. Bakeries. A boatyard. A maple syrup operation's been in the same family since before Confederation, or close enough that they like to say it. I knew which of my clients were 6 weeks from missing payroll before they did. I had a talent for that. Seeing the gap between what people said their numbers were and what their numbers actually were. Desmond died 8 years ago, a heart that simply stopped one Tuesday morning while he was clearing the eavesdrops, which is such an ordinary Canadian way to go, that I sometimes laugh about it now, though it took me 4 years to be able to. We had one daughter, Bridget. She is, and I say this with no exaggeration, the best thing either of us ever built. Smart, a little stubborn, finished her nursing degree at Queen's while working weekends at a Tim Hortons on Princess Street to help cover the gap between Desmond's pension and what we could spare. She married a man named Connor Ashbury 4 years ago. Connor came from a family that owned a chain of building supply stores across eastern Ontario. Ashbury Lumber and Supply. If you've ever driven the 401 corridor, you've probably seen the signs, faded red. The kind that look like they've been there since the 70s, because they have been. Connor's father, a man named Walter Ashbury, built that company from 1 yard in Belleville into 14 locations. Walter was 76 when Bridget and Connor married. Still sharp, still showed up at the Belleville location every Tuesday in steel-toed boots, even though he hadn't needed to be on his feet in a warehouse in 20 years. Everyone assumed Connor was the heir apparent. He had the title, Vice President of Operations, his name on the company truck doors, his photo at the Rotary Club fundraisers. What people didn't know, because I never told anyone, not even Bridget at first, was that Walter Ashbury had hired me, privately, 3 years before his son ever met my daughter, to do something nobody in his own family knew about. He'd had a falling out with his longtime accountant over a discrepancy in the Trenton location's books. Nothing criminal, just sloppy. The kind of sloppy that costs you $11,000 a quarter for 6 years before anybody notices. And a mutual client of ours, a hardware distributor in Napanee, had given him my name. I cleaned up that mess in 4 months. Walter Ashbury, a man who did not hand out compliments the way other men hand out business cards, told me I was the most thorough person he'd ever hired, and then he asked me to stay on. Quietly, as an independent consultant reviewing the books for all 14 locations twice a year, reporting directly to him, not to his finance department, not to his son. I did that work for 9 years. I want to be honest with you. I never once thought it would matter to my own life the way it eventually did. I thought of it as a steady, decent contract. The kind of thing that lets you replace a furnace without panicking about it. My sister's name is Renata. She is 4 years younger than me. And if you'd asked me, before all this, to describe her, I would have said generous things. Because that's what you do with family. Even the parts of family you've quietly stopped fully fee-trusting. Renata had been divorced twice, both times in a manner that left other people holding the cleanup. And she had a way of arriving in your life exactly when something good was happening to you. Smiling the whole time. Asking questions that sounded like interest and were actually inventory. I should tell you about the wedding. Because that's where this really starts. Even though the worst of it came later. It was a beautiful day in September. The kind Ontario gives you maybe 4 times a year as an apology for the other 361. The reception was at a renovated barn outside Picton. String lights, the whole production. Bridget looked luminous. Connor looked, I'll admit, like a man genuinely happy, and for a long while, I believed that happiness was real and uncomplicated, because I wanted to. Renata sat at the head table. I want to be precise about this. Because precision matters to me and it will matter to this story. She had not been asked to give a toast. The toast list had been finalized 2 weeks earlier by the wedding planner, approved by Bridget, 3 names, myself, Connor's best man, and Bridget's closest friend from nursing school. Renata stood up anyway. Mid-meal tapped her glass and the room, being a polite room full of people who didn't know any better, went quiet for her. What she said, more or less, word for word as I remember it, because I have replayed it more times than I'd like to admit. I've watched my niece grow up without nearly enough, and I am so happy she's finally landed. She'll never have to worry about money again. Some people just have an instinct for security. I like to think it runs in the family. On her father's side, obviously. And she laughed, this light little laugh, and looked at me while she said it. And half the room laughed along because they thought it was warmth. And they didn't understand it was a knife dressed up as a toast. I want to tell you I had a clever response ready. I didn't. I smiled the way you smile at a family gathering when you've decided, in that exact second, that you are not going to give anyone the show they're hoping for. What I didn't know that day, what none of us knew except Walter Ashbury and, as it turned out, my own attorney, was that 2 months before the wedding, Walter had quietly restructured Ashbury Lumber and Supplies ownership. Not because he distrusted Connor exactly, but because he had watched Connor for years and had come to a conclusion he never said out loud to his son. Connor was a good face for the company and a poor steward of it. He'd watched Connor make a habit of overspending on fleet upgrades he didn't need. Watched him avoid the hard conversations with underperforming managers. Because he didn't like conflict. Watched him take credit, gently, persistently, for cost corrections that I had identified and handed to Walter in spreadsheets Connor never saw. Walter had moved 58% of the company's voting shares into a family trust, and he had named me, not his son, not his daughter-in-law, not even his own brother, who'd been on the board for 15 years, as sole trustee. He told me this himself, over coffee at a diner in Belleville, 3 weeks before the wedding, sliding a manila folder across a sticky laminate table, the way other men might slide over a contract for a used truck. I'm not doing this because I don't love my son, he said. I'm doing it because loving him and trusting him to run 14 locations are 2 completely different things, and I've spent 6 years confusing the 2. He told me he wanted Bridget protected, going into a marriage, by someone who actually understood the business. He told me he trusted me, because I'd never once, in 9 years, told him what he wanted to hear instead of what was true. I remember sitting in that diner booth thinking, this is either the strangest gift anyone has ever given me, or the heaviest, and I still haven't fully decided which. Even now, I didn't tell Bridget. Walter asked me not to, not yet, not until there was a reason to, and I respected that, partly because I agreed with him and partly because I understood, in a way I think a lot of women my age understand, that being the quiet keeper of difficult information is sometimes the most useful thing you can be. So I sat at that wedding, smiling through my sister's toast, carrying a folder's worth of knowledge that would have changed the entire tenor of that barn in about 4 seconds, and I said nothing. That's its own kind of strength, even if nobody claps for it. 3 years passed. Bridget and Connor had a daughter, my granddaughter Susanna, and for a while I let myself believe the family had settled into something ordinary and fine. Renata came around for holidays, made her little comments, and I absorbed them the way you absorb weather. Walter's health began to decline, nothing dramatic, just the long slow erosion of a man in his late 70s. And he stepped back further from daily operations, which meant Connor's profile grew larger, his confidence grew louder, and somewhere in there I think, his discipline went soft, the way it does for men, who've never once been told no by anyone whose opinion they respected. I found out about the affair on a Thursday in February, the kind of gray Ontario Thursday, where the sky and the snowbanks are the same color, and the whole world feels like it's holding its breath. I wasn't even the one who found it. Bridget called me from the parking lot of the Belleville Canadian Tire, her voice doing that flat, controlled thing voices do right before they break, and told me she'd found texts on Connor's laptop, texts to a woman named Whitney, who worked in marketing at one of the Ashbury locations. It had been going on for 14 months. I drove the 40 minutes to Belleville faster than I should have on roads that still had ice in the shadows. And I sat with my daughter in her kitchen while she cried, in the specific, exhausted way of a person who has been quietly suspecting something for longer than they've let themselves admit. I made tea neither of us drank. I did not in that moment think about trusts or shares or any of it. I thought only about the fact that my daughter, who used to fall asleep on my chest as an infant in this exact county, in roughly this exact kind of February light, was sitting across from me utterly undone. Connor moved out within the week, into an apartment downtown, and within a month, Whitney had moved in with him. I want to tell you the specific detail that broke something loose in me. Because it's small, and I think small things often are the ones that do it. Renata, my own sister, had apparently known Whitney socially for over a year. They belonged to the same curling club. And instead of saying one single word to any of us, she had quietly grown closer to Whitney over that year, had her over for dinner twice, according to what I learned much later, while Bridget was at home raising a toddler and slowly being lied to. When the divorce proceedings began, Renata did something I genuinely did not see coming, even with everything I already knew about her. She started showing up to mediation sessions she had no business attending, sitting in waiting rooms, texting Connor's lawyer's assistant, whom she'd apparently befriended, asking about scheduling, offering, she said, to help keep things civil. What she was actually doing, it became clear, was positioning herself, quietly and persistently, on Connor's side of an increasingly ugly settlement, because Connor's family had money. And my sister has always had a compass that points, unerringly, toward whoever currently holds the most of it. The final settlement meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday in late October, in a conference room on the 9th floor of a law office on King Street in downtown Kingston, with a view, on clear days, of Lake Ontario going slate gray toward the horizon. That morning the sky was the color of an old nickel, low cloud, the particular flat light that makes everything in a room look slightly too honest. My attorney's name is Howard Pellinor. I'd hired him independently 9 years earlier, on the advice of Walter Ashbury himself, of all people, who told me over that same diner coffee that any woman doing serious financial work for a family business needed her own counsel, completely separate from the family's. I didn't fully understand at the time why a near stranger was giving me advice that careful. I understand it now. Howard is in his late 60s, unhurried, the sort of man who lets silences sit in a room until they start doing work on their own. Bridget and I arrived first. Renata arrived next, uninvited again, dressed in a cream wool coat that had clearly been purchased for this exact appearance, and sat down beside Connor at the far end of the table, where she had absolutely no legal standing to sit. She was not party to the divorce. She was not anyone's counsel. She was there plainly, to be seen choosing a side, and to make sure I watched her choose it. Connor's lawyer, a sharp, well-dressed man named Garth Linwood, opened with a settlement proposal that was on its surface reasonable, and was in fact built almost entirely on the assumption that Connor's equity position and operational title represented real, controlling value, the kind of value a court would protect for him as the company's evident future. It was designed, I understood immediately, to move quickly, before anyone looked too closely at what Vice President of Operations actually meant on paper versus in fact. Howard let him finish. He always lets people finish. Then Renata, because apparently 3 years hadn't taught her anything about reading a room, reached into her handbag and pulled out a single Canadian $50 bill. Crisp, almost certainly fresh from a bank machine that morning, and slid it down the polished table until it stopped directly in front of Bridget's water glass. "Take a cab home, sweetheart," she said, with that same light little laugh from the wedding 3 years earlier. This whole thing was always going to end up fine for everyone who actually understands how money works. No hard feelings. The room went completely still. Garth Linwood's pen stopped moving. Bridget's hand beside me curled slowly into a fist on her lap, and I put mine over it, not to stop her, just so she'd know I was there. And then Howard Pellinor laughed. Not a polite, throat-clearing sound. A real laugh, short and sharp, the kind that startles even the person doing it. It hit the glass walls of that conference room and came back at us. And Connor actually flinched, his chair scraping an inch against the carpet. "What exactly is funny?" Connor said, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound like the room still belonged to him. Howard took off his glasses, cleaned them slowly on his tie, an old habit of his, I've come to recognize as the thing he does right before he says something that's going to matter, and put them back on. "I apologize," he said. "I wasn't prepared for that gesture to become part of the official record today, but since it has, I think it changes the shape of this conversation considerably, and in my client's favor." He reached into the leather folder in front of him. He'd had it there the entire time, unopened. And I'd watched Garth Linwood's eyes pass over it twice without registering it as anything other than paperwork. And set it in the center of the table, rotated so the embossed letterhead faced Connor's side. "Explain," Renata said, her voice sharpening into something less rehearsed. "I'm laughing," Howard said, "because everyone on that side of the table appears to be operating under the belief that Connor Ashbury holds controlling authority over Ashbury Lumber and Supply. He tapped the folder once. He does not." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before it. The first silence had been the held breath, quiet of people waiting for someone to concede. This one had the hollow feeling of a floor, giving way somewhere underneath everyone in the room. Garth Linwood leaned forward. "That's a significant claim. I'll need to see documentation for." "You're looking at it," Howard said, and began sliding pages across the table, one at a time, unhurried. Walter Ashbury, 3 years earlier, had restructured the company's ownership into a family trust holding 58% of all voting shares. The controlling interest. Every acquisition, every major debt restructuring, any transaction above $350,000, required trustee sign-off. The trustee was not Connor. It had never been Connor. It was, and had been for 3 years, me. Eleanor Whitcomb was named sole trustee of the Ashbury Family Operating Trust. Howard said, "Mr. Ashbury retains his title and a minority equity position. He cannot execute a major transaction, restructure debt, or authorize a sale without trustee approval, without Eleanor's sign-off." Connor had gone very still. Not the restless stillness of a man waiting for his moment, but the rigid stillness of someone trying, in real time, to rebuild the entire architecture of what he thought his life had been resting on. Renata looked at him, then at the documents, then at him again, and for the first time in the more than 30 years I'd known her as an adult, she had absolutely nothing to say. "There's one further matter," Howard said. 9 years ago, before Eleanor began substantive work for the Ashbury family, I advised her to formalize her involvement through an independent consulting agreement, separate entirely from any family relationship that would later exist through her daughter's marriage. He slid a second document across. That agreement covered financial oversight, internal audit, and operational consulting across all 14 Ashbury locations. The documented value of that work includes correcting a 6-figure annual discrepancy at the Trenton location that had gone unaddressed for over 6 years. And structural cost reviews that saved the company in excess of $1.1 million over the life of the contract. He looked at Garth Linwood directly. Compensation under that agreement is a contractual obligation of the company itself. It is entirely separate from, and unaffected by, any marital settlement calculation. Which means the offer your client opened with this morning does not remotely reflect the actual financial landscape we're discussing. Garth Linwood asked for a recess. Howard gave him 20 minutes. Renata didn't say a single word to Connor during that entire recess. She sat with her hands folded on the table, looking out at the lake, which had gone the color of wet slate under the low cloud. The $50 bill stayed exactly where she'd left it, in front of Bridget's water glass. Nobody touched it. I won't walk you through every clause of the final settlement, because some of it stays between the people who lived it. And I think that's fair. What I'll tell you is what mattered. Connor kept his title and his minority stake. He kept the truck, the condo downtown, the watch he'd bought himself the year. The Belleville store hit its best quarter ever, on the strength of cost corrections he'd never once asked where they came from. What he lost was the story he'd been telling everyone, including himself, about what he actually controlled. My consulting agreement was honored in full. The trust structure was formalized as part of the settlement record. Bridget walked away with a settlement that reflected reality, not the version Garth Linwood had hoped nobody would question. Renata left the building before the final signatures were even exchanged. I heard the door, the particular sound of someone trying to leave quietly and not quite managing it. I heard, months later, through my cousin in Napanee, who hears everything eventually, that Renata and Whitney had had some kind of falling out at the curling club. Of all places, over something nobody could fully explain, and that Renata had stopped showing up to league nights altogether. I don't take pleasure in that exactly. I take something closer to a tired kind of peace. Walter Ashbury called me 2 weeks after the settlement. He didn't say much, he never did. He asked how Bridget was holding up. He asked, almost as an afterthought, whether the trust paperwork had held up the way he'd hoped it would. There was a long pause on the line, the kind he always let sit, and then he said, "You always saw that company more clearly than my own son did, Eleanor. I just made sure the paperwork finally said so." He passed away the following spring, peacefully, at home, and I stayed on as trustee through the transition, helping his daughter, Connor's sister, who turned out to have far more of her father's instincts than anyone had given her credit for, step into a role she was, it turns out, entirely capable of holding. I still live in the stone farmhouse outside Kingston. Bridget and Susanna are close by now, a 15-minute drive, which after everything feels like exactly the right distance. Near enough for Sunday dinners, far enough that we each still have our own lives. I consult independently these days, mostly for small family businesses across Eastern Ontario, who need someone willing to find the gap between what the books say and what's actually true. I'm good at finding that gap. I always have been. Here's what I want to leave you with, because I think about it more than almost anything else from that whole stretch of my life. My sister slid that $50 bill across the table because she had already decided, long before she walked into that room, exactly what kind of woman I was. Quiet, past my prime, easy to overlook. She wanted me to confirm the story she'd already written. What she never once considered, what people like her rarely do, is the years of work that happen before anyone's watching. The spreadsheets at midnight. The contracts nobody photographs. The slow, unglamorous accumulation of being right, again and again, in rooms where nobody was keeping score, except the one person who eventually mattered. The people who underestimate you aren't always wrong about everything. Sometimes they're right that you're quiet, right that you don't take up much space at the table. They're just wrong about what that means. So, I'll ask you the same thing I've been asking myself since that October morning. Has someone in your own life underestimated you so completely that when the truth finally came out, even you were a little surprised by what you'd quietly built? Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them.